think we're ready to start. I am not Amy Earhart. I am not the chair of this. Surprise, I'm not Amy Earhart. But I am the convener of this panel that is called Teaching with Text Encoding in and Out of the Classroom. We have what we think is a kind of a unique way of having a conversation about what we're going to be doing. Essentially what this group represents a goodly chunk of authors of a new volume that we're working on what it means to teach text encoding in different contexts. And it's a great day for pedagogy in the digital humanities. If you go to Debates in DH on the Manifold site, Brian and my collected volume of what we teach when we teach DH just went open an hour ago, 2 hours ago, for the world to read. So huzzah, another volume out in the world about pedagogy. So the way we're going to work with this is each of the presenters will introduce themselves. They will each speak for 5 minutes, giving you some information on the way in which their chapters are evolving and the questions that they're asking in their chapters that will then inform the volume that we're editing. After that, each of them has spoken for 5 minutes, we'll do what we're calling a lightning round. 2 quick questions that we hope will be provocative to them and hopefully to the audience. And then what we would like to do is spend as much time as possible having a discussion with the group, because the best way to get feedback about something you're writing is to get feedback from the people you hope will read it. So with that being said, Brian, are you ready?
As ready as I'm going to get.
Okay, I'm going to take your seat while you're sitting.
Okay. So peanuts. I got fascinated with distant reading at the end of graduate school. This was a way to read at scale, reading all of an author's work rather than the exceptional excerpts that I had so often spent my time with to that point. And while there are plenty of people at this conference and elsewhere who work with thousands of texts or tens of thousands of texts, I've generally been more interested in working with modest corpora composed of all the works of a single author, so often on the scale of maybe 15 texts. As long as, what I aim for is I want to have enough text in a corpus that's too much for a class to read in a given semester. And the way I've done this, getting the data available for my classes to work, because I also prefer to work with in-copyright texts, because I think that's more interesting for me. I've generally solved this problem with a process of dismantling books, and then with my students, running them through scanners and good enough OCR. And as I've discussed at DH conferences in the past, if you could time travel back to Toronto, Montreal in 2017, you could hear me give a talk about this. This allows me to teach my students not just about digital humanities qua distant reading, but digital humanities qua digitizing the humanities. What does it take to actually convert things into digital objects? But Peanuts posed a challenge. Since the strip ran for 50 years, there was plenty of material for distant reading, but since comics are, of course, primarily a visual medium, each individual panel in a strip is worth the proverbial 1,000 words, and yet there is no way to read the words that are not actually visible. And if it's impossible to read all of Peanuts in a given semester, and it is, it's even more impossible to encode them, because surprise, in this session about text encoding, I'm going to talk about text encoding. And so the result was that this experiment with working with Peanuts had to extend across multiple years, multiple semesters and classes, which meant that my students and I had to figure out not only how to describe Schultz's work in a text encoding environment, but also had to describe our own work to those who would follow us, the future students who would come beyond, so we could communicate what we had been doing and how we would be sort of carrying on. So what we did is we ended up writing our own guidelines for our project. And so if something like TEI and CBML are the guidelines with big capital letters, what we produced were guidelines with sort of small letters, the little g guidelines. So just one example of a problem we had to solve is in Peanuts, Charles Schulz tends to write all of his character's speech with capital letters on block printing. So one of the very first questions we had to ask ourselves as we were trying to encode strips was, how do we represent the character's speech? Do we write that in sentence case, which would feel more comfortable, it's easier to read for most people, or would we preserve his capitalization? We went back and forth on this until we ran into some other strips in which he uses different scripts. And so while we could have used XSLT and any other ways to transform sentence capitalization, which again would have been easier to type, we decided it was just simpler, rather than coming up with a bunch of transforms and other layers of encoding, to just write the speech as it normally happens in all capitalization. At the same time, we had to ask ourselves, are we going to encode the line breaks in the speech? Because if you encode poetry or historical manuscripts, of course you're going to do that. Here, we decided not to be bound by Schulz's practice, because we couldn't actually ever identify a point in which we saw a strip where we knew he had laid it out purposely to have breaks. He would letter the strips first after he'd sort of drafted them. The letters went in first before he drew the pictures, but his praxis seems to be guided by just simply making it all fit around the image. So we didn't think for his praxis that the line breaks were all that important. So what's at stake in these two decisions, determining where we would be faithful to Schulz's presentation in one case but not the other? First and foremost was helping the students learn that any scholarly project must make choices about what is and within and what is without its scope. Such choices are often not apparent until starting. And second was creating a sense of collectivity in which the students with me were sort of making these decisions as we were going on. I am not a comics scholar by training, and so while I was the teacher, I was very much a dilettante, and that was useful, where I could say to them, I don't have a clear answer to this, and we could sort of collectively decide in a democratic way about what we were going to do. And that led us to making a lot of choices. The power goes down to the collective. Okay. What did we learn? Just as a quick summary, the first thing we learned is how to read comics closely. I talked about this at that DH21 in Tokyo, the way this helps us. The next thing was it allowed us to start answering research questions. I'm not going to tell you about that today. It helped my students understand how to work collectively on the process of encoding and to produce these sort of shared guidelines. And the last thing was this question of, again, the big guidelines versus the small guidelines. I hate going to the TEI guidelines. I find them scary. I find them difficult to read. It's like finding aids at an archive.
To calm them down up here.
And I'm lucky that I have good colleagues and friends that can answer the questions for me if I don't know how to do them. But by creating our own guidelines, one of the things that it helped my students and I see was how the guidelines in the capitals are actually collectively authored as well. And they're always they're in flux and they're changing and they're made by people for people. The guidelines are here to help us do our work. And so that was actually a really useful thing, is to sort of see the way in which our guidelines were created ramified into the real guidelines. So that's it for me.
Thank you. What Brian doesn't understand is that he just lost 5 friends.
No,
Or we will consider carefully whether or not we answer his questions next time he. Anyway.
I still have Ellie.
That's true you do. James, over to you. Please introduce yourself and.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay. My name is James Cummings. I'm a reader in digital textual studies and late medieval literature at Newcastle University, way up north in England. And I used to be a member of the TI Technical Council for 15 years or so. I'm now an elected member of the TI Board of Directors. I'm trying to help make sure they still have funding to do the things they need to do. My chapter in this volume is called Teaching with the TI Abstract Model, a New Approach for Introductory Workshops. And it comes out of recognizing a problem in the way we often teach TEI in intensive pre-conference workshops or even week-long DH summer schools like the one I set up in Oxford. These often start by introducing the TI generally and then focus on providing participants with some hands-on experience in applying markup. Jumping around on my screen, sorry. With applying markup or XML, and that has to be taught, and introductory exercises reinforce the concepts of well-formedness and validity and what that means in the chosen XML editor that they're using. As the workshop progresses, it tends to teach more of the TEI structure and more vocabulary. Students become more accustomed to the markup. And after covering a lot of ground, workshops then might conclude with demonstrations of both how to customize the TEI framework and publish TEI documents. And that's a very typical sort of way we tend to teach TEI workshops. Some problems with this approach, though, is that it leads participants to focus on basic TEI structures, because that's all you really have time to teach, and limited embedded markup forms of the TEI, and the low-hanging fruit sort of approaches to any problems that they might encounter. Indeed, the TEI guidelines themselves don't always help in providing only the most basic of examples. If participants don't go away and read the TI guidelines, they'll have a very limited understanding of the underlying framework as a whole. As a result, they may find fault with straightforward aspects, such as the lack of availability of certain elements in some locations, or the over-availability of approaches elsewhere in other places. My chapter proposes an alternative approach to teaching the TEI workshops, which involves separating the expression of the TEI in XML from the abstract or conceptual modeling underlying the TEI framework. Workshops following this approach foreground the why and the what of encoding tasks more than the how that we usually do. They teach the customization of the generalized TEI framework up front, after introducing the TI abstract model, but crucially before introducing any concept of XML markup. This approach seeks to develop a comprehensive understanding of the TI framework while also catering to users whose primary engagement with TI documents might be through content editing interfaces like LeafWriter, rather than directly with the XML serialization. One benefit of doing this is that the participants understand the nature of the TI methodologies, such as URI-based pointing to out-of-line metadata, much more readily, and they're more willing to customize the TEI as they were taught to use the TI's Roma web app before trawling through all of the vocabulary of the TEI. However, this also leads to a drawback. In my experience so far, while the TI scheme is a framework that all projects should customize to their own use, being more au fait with customization meant that these participants tended to go to this as an answer to any problems they encountered. For example, back in the days of DTDs, when I was working for a project around the year 2000. My God, that's 24 years ago. I suddenly feel very old. I had a boss who I explained, we could add a new element to just our version of the TEI to solve that problem. And as soon as we did that, that was his answer to every single problem we ever encountered. And so that's a drawback of focusing on customization. So that's vaguely what my chapter is about.
Julia?
Thank you.
All right, we'll clap for you.
Sorry.
Hooray.
Just did it so deftly.
I'm Julia Flanders. I work at Northeastern University, and I teach TEI in classroom settings, workshop settings, and also project settings and individual research settings, so things like graduate students working on dissertations. And my starting point here is that there are lots of different pedagogical spaces where text encoding can play an important role, not only or not primarily as the project of learn the TEI, but also things like understand data representation, or learn about how markup works generally, or learn about digital scholarly editions or digital publication workflows. And text encoding has a distinctive potential in these spaces. It's transparent, it's visible, it resists black boxing. It has, a lot of the adjacent skills also use the same concepts and languages, so things like XML, XSLT, ODD, HTML. Once you introduce TEI, that kind of unlocks a much wider range of skills. It's a technology focused on creating possibilities for essential humanities thought activities like description, historicization, editing, annotation, analysis, remixing, publication. And it's a really helpful and thought-provoking space concerning all kinds of humanities research concerns about textuality and artifactuality, about structured and unstructured information, about the nature of the categories and the descriptors that we create for research materials. And text encoding is also pedagogically really well connected because it offers ways into information science, digital publishing, programming, digital libraries, archives, all that kind of stuff, which students are really interested in. So depending on pedagogical settings and goals, there are thus many different ways to teach text encoding and even many different approaches to teaching the TEI itself. The focus of my chapter, which was titled To TEI or Not to TEI, I think that was what we ended up with, was on how these different approaches manifest in decisions about schema design, which really is the element of design that establishes the fundamental parameters of the course activities. For example, whether students are being invited to improvise or whether they're being asked to work towards a convergent outcome, whether they are learning a language or learning about how language works, whether they're being presented with a kind of safely limited and circumscribed space or a wildly inspiring overabundance of possibilities, whether they're being guided towards proficiency or critical problematization or both. So a quick review of the different pedagogical goals that I see as being particularly in play here. First of all, that students understand the concept of code, i.e. systems of formal notation that represent meaning or that communicate intention. So students being able to read, understand, and produce markup, Two, students understand data modeling, which is a form of analysis. So students are able to examine an artifact or an inscription, identify its component parts as we understand them, and create a formal model of it. Three, students examine artifacts and texts with close analytical scrutiny. Four, students are reflective and transparent about what they are seeing when they read and about how they interpret it and why. And they're able to formalize those observations and interpretations through markup and also in accompanying critical writing. Five, students are aware of transcription and editing and curation as scholarly practices that have implications for the kinds of research activities we can undertake. Six, students learn specifics of the TEI language, we do finally get around to that, either in itself or in comparison with other XML languages, and they're able to use it to develop or contribute to digital projects. Seven, students learn about the TEI as a community-supported modeling system and the implications of that community-supported nature for the way the TEI has evolved and the way that it works. 8, students learn about XML as one form of data modeling that is both analogous to and different from other kinds of data models, such as database systems or ontologies or RDF or whatever. And they're able to make decisions about what modeling approaches are appropriate in given circumstances or to support particular kinds of analysis. And 9, students become aware of how the digital resources they encounter in the world are products of this kind of modeling process. So they're able to see and understand digital models as meaning systems that also carry disciplinary and cultural positionality. So with this context, in the rest of the chapter, I outline several different kinds of schema approaches that can support these learning goals, but also support different kinds of pedagogical contexts. And I'm going to run through them very quickly. First of all, just templated and strongly constrained TEI, where you provide the students with a tightly constrained schema focused on the specific activities that the instructor has planned. The second one is a full open-ended TEI, where you basically provide students with TEI all or something like that. Maybe with an encoding template, maybe not. And that's a good option when learning TEI is an important goal of the course, and also where you have a lot of time to teach a lot of TEI. A third option is student-led customization of the TEI, where you involve students directly in the process of creating a customization for the class or for their own projects. The fifth is to build a non-TEI schema. In other words, teach students to use RelaxNG to build their own schema. And then, you could pivot and talk about the TEI or maybe not. And the fifth is just schema-free XML, which I often liken to finger painting. Basically just say, look, here's oxygen, or maybe not even here's oxygen. Let's just draw on the whiteboard and experiment with the idea of what it means to name and delimit components of a textual artifact or some other artifact that we care about. I suspect I'm going over time, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
All right. I need to see. Right, I can see you.
Yeah.
But how do we get a screen to see you? PC?
Probably.
PC, oh, well,
Wait and hope. Maybe.
PC, oh, wait.
How many? Oh, it's this thing. That.
It was the last minute's pass. Ta-da.
Ta-da.
Do we need this? Oh, wait, that's the,
It's just not quick.
right, and I need to get rid of the chat. Sorry, people in chat. No, I'm not gonna end the meeting. That would be bad. So very, very bad.
We can send something else, hold on.
Okay. Or you could just read the chat.
Yeah.
That's
Leave
fine.
the chat up.
Yeah.
So while we're waiting. There it goes, okay.
Okay. So I'd like to introduce my chapter. So efforts toward text encoding education in a country where TI was not spread. So a case study in Japan. So there was a gap between DH and text encoding until around 2010 and beyond. So DH-like research has been conducted in Japan since 1980s. But so it had been mainly led by information scientists, and so text encoding was difficult to be spread because of difficulties of character encoding and coding code by popularization of Unicode. So then it was difficult to share Japanese text with other languages on computers. So it has almost been solved recently. And then so dominant mindset to text encoding. So it should not be a work of researchers and librarians, but of publishers, printing companies, and IT companies, and so on. So it was necessary to form a committee of scholars who valued text encoding. So then to foster the committee of text encoding, at that time there were very few resources on TI in Japanese language. So they were almost provided in English. then no guidelines, no tutorials, tools, or Q&As in Japanese or text or for Japanese text. So this was difficult for Japanese text researchers, the volume zone of the Japanese humanities, to understand. So we aim to build a Japanese environment for TEI. So a few researchers started to make some resources. For example, so examples of encoded Japanese text, Japanese guidelines for Japanese text, and translation of the P5 guidelines into Japanese. Then establishment of the SIG East Asian Japanese in 2016 has very helpful. So then, and then to foster the community in the classroom in the University of Tokyo. So the teaching TEI in the context of DH education in the Graduate School of Humanities and Sociology in the university since 2012, and it's now conducted as a half-year course for cultural encoding with TEI and IIIF. So it's contributed to the environment as after school activities. So this part of the students translated a paper of transactionography, and so made Japanese subtitles of a MOOC in the Daria Teach. Then so especially translating are useful for their understanding on text encoding. Then so, and then so out of the classroom, so holding a weekly online meeting on TEI by the SIG East Asian Japanese since last year. Then so what we have done so far to make environment for a Japanese TEI. So we published an introductory book for TEI in Japanese in 2022. So then the book has inspired humanities researchers to embark on TEI. Then to foster the environment, we received a grant of about $100,000 US over 3 years last year from a Japanese government research funding agency. And recently, so we released a TEI viewer for East Asian classics, which makes encoders visualize their TEI text very easily, only by uploading the XML file. So then, so this is a typical visualization of a critical edition of Japanese poetry with IIIF compliant image, witness images. So then, so in and out of the classroom, so I'd like to introduce my teaching activity. So as a methodological commons, since many of my students are graduate students and researchers in various fields of humanities, then after briefly teaching the general matters described in chapter 3, so I'm seeking for the commonality with students among textile studies. For example, in 13th chapter, so critical apparatus of usefulness for philological activities in general. The 12th chapter, so representation of primary sources for autographs of modern writers and various interventions in medieval and as a manuscript in general, so and so on. Then, so recently, the 9th chapter, computer-mediated communication, will have a huge possibility with not only general humanities researchers, but also sociologists. Then, so as a part of the result, the following types of textual materials were encoded and presented in some international and or domestic conferences by young researchers in each field. See there, so but it's a biological biographical records, Buddhist dictionary, Buddhist commentary books, modern historical documents, and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Don't want to exit the system because that's going to cause all sorts of woe.
Don't look at it.
Now
Look
we're
at
just going
yourself.
to be
Blind.
afraid. Sorry, Martina, it'll take a minute. Oh, it was weird. It happened while I was not touching it. Like things started, okay. Now it's back.
It's not very quick.
How do you encode this? I don't know what to. Okay, there it goes again. Martina.
Yeah, hello, I'm Martina Scholger. I'm a senior scientist at the Department of Digital Humanities from the University of Graz. And I'm teaching both in master students in digital humanities and at summer schools. And today I'm also here as a representative of the IDE, the Institute for Documentology and Scholarly Editing, which is a group of German and Austrian scholars focusing on the use of digital methods for editions of various documents. And in my chapter, I will focus on non-curricular training opportunities in the field of text encoding and scholarly editing. And since 2028, we have been regularly organizing week-long schools on methods and technologies for digital scholarly editing. And in these beginners and advanced schools, we teach editing methods and all the chapters that James was already talking about, also processing of XML encoding data and the publication using various tools. And in recent schools, we also offered some specialized topics, NLP and interface design. So we try to expand a little bit. The school's curriculum is always adapted to the respective target group. So we have different partners, and so we want to fit the curriculum for that. The learners range from graduate students who are supplementing the regular university program to postdoc researchers and project members who have specific needs related to their research programs. And when we started 16 years ago, the digital humanities was a marginal discipline in German-speaking countries with heterogeneous and limited teaching offers. In recent times, with the development of dedicated digital humanities curricula, text encoding, and in general, digital scholarly editing has found its place in university curricula. And only recently, so at the end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024, 2 professorships have been established that explicitly focus on digital editing, one in Cologne and one in Vienna. So, thus, we could now ask if we still need schools and strands like those from the IDE, or ADROM organized by the University of Paderborn, or all the great schools in Oxford, summer school, GHSI, and so on and so forth. And we believe the answer is yes, of course, we need them.
Hooray!
Scary for a minute.
So the demand for extracurricular training like schools, workshops, online courses continues, and there's still a gap to close for many researchers who did not have the opportunity to benefit from such DH programs, or they are already working in a project and had not the opportunity, or that they don't have access to university courses anymore. And there's also a very close connection and synergy between teaching TI in schools and university curricula. because many of the IDE members and former school participants are directly involved in these curricular developments in their function as professors, members of the curricular commissions, or as lecturers. So we in turn can benefit from the experience of the schools on how to structure teaching and how to engage with our students. So for a poster presentation at the DHD 2019 conference, we did a survey among former IDE participants on their school experience, which we redid now for this chapter. Altogether, we received 133 responses. I will present the results in the chapter, but to give an insight, of 75% considered themselves as working in the digital scholarly editing since, and the majority of those who replied that they had left that field or even academia since confirmed that the skills they acquired were very relevant to their respective careers, for example, as communicators between the humanities and computer science. To conclude, in my chapter, I will talk about building models, text encoding, and digital scholarly editing that they are key skills in digital humanities, of course. That schools have been offering practical and useful training in digital skills to colleagues who do not have access to university courses. And for us as instructors, the experiences gained from schools are extremely valuable for building regular university curricula. And schools and similar train-the-trainer formats ensure the distribution of knowledge and skills, which is particularly important and valuable when it comes to sharing standards and community-approved practices. Thank you.
I realized I was so excited to have everybody start talking that I think I forgot to explain the larger context of what we're doing with this book. Surprise, I forgot to say something. While I was teasing Brian about, dissing the guidelines, what we actually are trying to do is gather perspectives, and I think you may have seen it in the breadth of talks there, that don't necessarily have to do with TEI, right? We really wanted to think more broadly about what does it mean to encode texts, what different kinds of texts are there. Another of the authors is focusing on musicology. And we were looking at Epidoc and some different ways of capturing information through encoding. And we're also trying to find different perspectives on it. And so that's why the title is In and Out of the Classroom. And as you've seen, and as many of you, I see a number of you in the room, Kathy and Walter, and Walter is on the SIG, the Pedagogy and Training SIG with Brian and me. Kathy has been teaching DH classes, courses, workshops, for as long as I have, actually. I think we were one of the first ones together. So it's really important to think about what it means to teach as broadly as possible and what it means to us as practitioners who also teach in some form. What does that do to us? Which is my way of spinning into the first of our two lightning round questions. And this one is, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to give an answer in 60 seconds or so, and have you think as well about what this might mean to you in your context. The first question is, how does text encoding change your students' lives or studies? And remember, we're talking about students in the broadest context. And let's start with Martina.
No pressure.
That's what you do when you teach. You throw a spanner in the works.
Yeah, I think the process of building models and encoding helps the students also to think in structures and in a very systematic way. That's not only for our courses, but I can also see that later in their thesis, where they start to think differently and better structure their on the one hand, the encoding, create the models, and on the other hand, also for the thesis.
Awesome, thank you. Kiyonori?
Yes, so in a kind of practical aspect, so text encoding has provided an opportunity for students who have not studied mathematics or statistics to think about their textual research in an abstract way. And it has also led to relatively easy presentation of their research in a kind of DH-related conferences. And it has broadened their perspective on their textual research. So then this has also contributed to broadening the basis of the DH.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Julia? That sounded very ominous, Julia.
Yeah. Do you want to share anything with the class?
What is that?
I think that for me, in my experience, text encoding gives students a different understanding of the concept of code and coding. And this may be at least partly because in the university where I work, programming is very heavily pushed to humanities students. And in fact, the humanities is generally and systemically de-emphasized in favor of STEM disciplines. And so the idea that humanists can learn to code and that means programming has a lot of traction. But I feel like what text encoding does is it broadens out that term, and in a way it takes us back fruitfully to the spirit of early discussions of the difference between declarative descriptive markup and procedural markup. Students by nature expect code to do something directly, and markup doesn't work like that. And so it kind of makes them a little more cosmopolitan in their sense of what the term code means. And I think markup also sometimes bridges across from concepts of code as aligned with the sort of tool machine aspect, from there to code as formalism, or code as structured knowledge, or code as signification, which I think really empowers the humanities students greatly and gives them a lot to work with and good connections to make with the critical readings that they're doing. And it also gives students a more sort of supple and humanities-oriented understanding of code functioning as a form of language and thinking. So a humanities knowledge space rather than a form of machine space, which I think they find very empowering. I hope they find it empowering.
I suspect they do.
Maybe just baffling.
James?
Yeah, that. In addition to teaching sort of like one-off workshops and things like that, I also teach TEI to undergraduates in a school of English. And they come in terrified that they'll have to do some sort of procedural programming or something like that of some sort. But by the time they leave, they're less afraid of computers or think that it's a mystery that they're not going to be able to solve. In fact, they end up having that sort of sense of confidence of well, if I've mastered that thing that I was massively afraid of, now I could go on and learn R, or I could go on and learn stylometry or something like that. Indeed, I recently had an English literature student with no computer experience of which to speak after doing our capstone project, sort of final thesis dissertation by digital edition, where they work with the special collections to take a digitized object from special collections, a 17th century or earlier object, and do an edition of it, published in TI Publisher. They went on to do a master's in data science at a nearby university. Most of the students end up heading towards things like publishing or archival kind of destinations. We also have a course in our MA program called Manuscript Print Digital, where the students over successive years have been working on a 17th century cookbook by Jane Lorraine. And they take Jane Lorraine's cookbook and encode the recipes in it. And one of the problems with that is all the kind of work that Julia talked about in terms of determining the schema that they did was done by the very first year that did that class. And then every successive year has been stuck with the decisions of that first year. And one of the things they do is write a reflective piece on how they hate those people from 3 or 4 years ago because they made this really bad decision. But that's, yeah. I guess another thing they learn is that there is markup everywhere. I do the sort of watershed thing of showing them a docx file, renaming it .zip, unzipping it, showing them the XML underneath that we've just created by, making something bold and italic or something like that. And they believe up until that point that text is bold or text is italic, rather than it being markup that constructs it and renders it as such.
Thank you. Brian?
So I've thought of a couple of things. First, coming from literary studies, I think the greatest thing that encoding text does for my students is makes them read it very closely. If one of my students once called it reading closer than close. She was an English major but she had never read anything quite as closely as she'd had to do while trying to mark up a text. And so that just getting the students to slow down and look and make those decisions, I think is really useful for teaching the way that we want them to read. I've definitely seen it open up some employment opportunities for students who have gone on and gotten jobs simply because they already knew Oxygen and had learned XML. And then I've also found that a surprising number of my students confess in slightly ashamed tones that they love this. They really enjoy the sort of putting things in boxes and here I'm cribbing a bit from Diane in my chapter in the recently published online, What We Teach When We Teach DH, you can read it now for free, is that I think a nice thing about digital humanities for some of our students is the feeling of, I am looking at a real thing. And instead of working with poetry and like, where are the hidden symbols and where are the feelings? It's like, no, I'm counting words, or I can point to an exact thing. And I think the neatness of that is part of what appeals to even humanities students at times, is to feel like I am counting a thing that is there, I'm declaring it, and that feels simpler and better than sometimes wondering if you're just making stuff up.
Interesting.
I made that up.
Okay. I have to wrap my head around that because I think my experience is almost exactly the opposite.
We wrote that chapter together.
No, I know that. I remember that.
You didn't say so bad.
I should have said something. All right, our second question, and this is not a surprise to anyone because many people who are practitioners in the digital humanities came up at a time when there weren't these kinds of classes and workshops were fewer. And we didn't come to these things as teachers necessarily of text encoding or digital humanities more broadly. So what was the thing you had to teach yourself in order to teach text encoding? I'll start with Brian.
So the hardest thing for me was writing the assignments, because I get to most of the time lean on the shoulders of teachers that my students have had in previous forms, right? They've all had to write an essay. They've all had to look at a poem before they get to university. No one in my classes has ever encoded anything before. And so trying to figure out, how do I explain something that is very complicated in an assignment that they can follow so they can then not be scared about the grade they'll receive. And so that has taken a lot of work to figure out the right way to structure an assignment so that the students have some agency and some flexibility, but also can feel like they know what they're doing.
Jane?
I'm going to start with what I've not learned well enough, which is marketing, in that getting very risk averse and much more risk averse than North American students in terms of what classes they're doing. Because we don't give them such flexibility of, extensions and things, yeah, getting them to realize all the things all the panel members have said of like, wow, this is really a good, useful skill to learn. It's closer than close reading. It teaches you to think abstractly about how to categorize information, all of those kinds of things. Explaining that to a second-year undergraduate who's going to be registering for a module, a class, in the future is a very difficult sell. So I'm not very good at marketing that. And so my dissertation, my digital edition module is always under recruiting. It's not getting enough students. We still run it, but it's not enough for what it should be getting, I think. The difference is if I offer a 1-day, 2-day or longer week-long workshop on TEI for digital humanities researchers and open it up free to the world or something like that, I'm inundated with people. So yeah, it's the marketing that I've not learned. Other than that, patience and understanding, meeting the students where they are. Like, I find lots of things about this kind of stuff very easy, and those students don't necessarily find those types of ways of thinking as easy. So reminding myself that just because I can do it, I always assume if I can do it, anybody can do it, and therefore I need to make sure I'm meeting them on their ground, I guess. Yeah.
Julie?
Yeah, like James, I felt like the first thing I needed to learn was sort of defamiliarizing myself with what I knew, because I had already become a proficient encoder before I started thinking about how to teach it. And I went back to those early moments when I said to Sid things like, this sick core element, and he would be like, it's not a sick core element, it's a sick element with a core attribute. Like, sort of getting back to that place and thinking, yes, this is where you are, this is the level of ignorance that you have. Trying to remember what things are and are not genuinely confusing to novices. But I think almost more important than that was I had to learn a lot more about the systems that invisibly underlie and ramify text markup, so that I could explain them when necessary and also troubleshoot around them. And these are things that one does not generally learn when one is learning TEI. So things like namespaces, Unicode, why numbers are not allowed as the first character of an element or attribute name, bidirectional writing systems, how parsing software works, the concept of serialization, the inner workings of Sebastian's style sheets and how the TEI customization process works. And a note here, I did not actually teach myself these things. I learned them from my colleague Sid Bauman, who is a person of infinite patience and great expertise. So, but I think that one thing that I see among humanities faculty colleagues is the assumption that once you take a TEI workshop, then you can teach TEI. And I think that you can sort of teach TEI, but you're not going to be able to answer most of the most interesting questions that the students are going to come to you with. And then the final thing is, and this is echoing something Brian said, is to think and learn a lot about the narrative order in which the process of learning text encoding makes sense. So where do you start? You don't start with everything. You start with a certain version of everything, and then you add. And what is a story you can tell that will enable students to make sense of the TEI, as opposed to what is the information you need to give them so that they ingest the information, I guess, is the way I would put it.
Kiyonori?
Yes, so since I'm a textual researcher in a specific field, Buddhist text, especially philosophical and philological field, so I had to learn about the way and method of textual studies in other fields, so, as well as the methodologies and ideas behind such research. For example, so there are many types of text in East Asia and Japan, and in Japan. So poetry. So so philosophical text and general fiction or something like that. Not only such text, but also I collaborated with young researchers of kind of Western texts, such as French old manuscript, kind of medieval Latin manuscript, or modern French, German, and English fictions or something like that. So I studied from the students. And this was an opportunity to deepen my understanding. And such learning has also been opportunity to bring depth to my own textual and DH research and to collaborate internationally with other types of textual researchers. Thank you.
Martine?
Yeah, I can also add to that, because what I have students coming from different bachelor disciplines, and they have a lot of great ideas and great material. And I'm not a linguist. I did not do philology. I'm coming from art history. I have also
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. I did not know that.
Yeah. And so we also have archaeologists who want to learn text encoding. And so all the different materials where I had no idea before, so it's how to encode it. So I had to teach myself how to deal with that, so that I can help them a little bit. Yeah, and for the assessment, at the beginning, I did an assessment where they had to encode certain parts, and now we do little projects with at the end poster presentations. So they came with their own material and then encode it. And so I can see that they are really engaged with that and go really deep into that, and that's really cool.
Thank you. So I'm going to take convener's prerogative and say, because I think we all live breathing rarefied air when we come to these events, right? We're with people who it's very normal to get super excited about the work that we see in one of these sessions, and we bump into friends who are doing something that we didn't know they were doing, and suddenly we get caught up in that and we go back. And if you're like me, you get super excited and you jump up and down and your hands start flapping around a lot. And then you go back to your classroom perhaps and you do the same thing, and your students are terrified of you because you're walking around like this and you're making what look like gang signs because you're trying to explain to them that pointy brackets, it's an empty type. So it's the question of modulating, I think, sometimes the enthusiasm that we can allow ourselves to feel in these spaces, and balancing the way in which you want to bring students into that place and those things that you are so passionate about and you're so excited about, without terrifying them and having them run out of the room thinking like that is a very curious woman standing up at the front of the classroom. But with that, we would like to invite you, well, first of all, thank all of our speakers again. Sorry.